Welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast, brought to you by the Investment Banking Leaders Club, your exclusive access to the industry's most successful leaders. These experts have closed thousands of deals, generating hundreds of billions of dollars, and they're here to share their strategies, insights, and leadership lessons that can fast-track your career. But the learning doesn't stop here. Join the Investment Banking Leaders Club at ibleadersclub.com for even more exclusive insights, leadership frameworks, and career accelerating resources and events. Thanks for joining us, and best of luck on your growth journey. We have a big podcast first today as we talk to a top corporate finance lawyer to bring you fresh leadership perspectives. And we start at the very top of the chain with an industry titan. I'm beyond excited to be joined by Greg Rodgers, a partner in global law firm Latham Watkins, New York and Los Angeles offices. Now, Greg serves as a vice chair of Latham's corporate department and is a member of the firm's capital markets and public company representation practices. Greg spent 26 years of his 28-year career at Latham Watkins, starting as a junior lawyer and growing through the ranks to help lead Latham's corporate department today. And a little bit about Latham's corporate department. It's the largest among the firm's departments, and their powerhouse team around the globe represents the largest bulge bracket investment banks, private equity houses, venture capital firms, and even sovereign wealth funds, Fortune 100 corporations, and cutting-edge startups on their most complicated and critical transactions. And in his leadership role, Greg helped set the vision and the growth strategy for the department, including overseeing personnel, talent management, and ensuring the firm stays ahead of any new trends. And under his guidance, the corporate department continues to grow and is leading the industry in this regard. If that wasn't enough, in his personal practice, Greg is widely regarded as among the most prominent capital markets lawyers, particularly in the equity-linked and debt security offerings areas, where he's a leading authority across the US. He's been instrumental in pioneering direct listings, notably advising Spotify on its groundbreaking approach to becoming a public company, and has advised on a vast majority of direct listings today. And having got to know Greg a little, I've learned that he puts his success down to picking the right area of law that really plays to his strengths, adhering to values, his relentlessness to deliver high quality work and do the absolute best by his clients, robust time management, strong networking, and his ability to solve problems as well as be creative for his clients. I'm pumped, Greg, to have you on the show today to unpack much of your strengths and successes. So welcome to the Investment Banking Leaders Podcast, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm blushing a bit listening to that intro. I'm a listener of the podcast, and I'm humbled to have the chance to contribute. This is my first podcast, so it should be fun. The disclosure lawyer in me feels obliged to point out that the management of the corporate department, which is a multi-billion-dollar business at Latham, is a team play effort. And so I'd say I help guide the department, not guide the department personally. Not to split hairs, but teamwork is how we operate at Latham.
Love that. Love that we start out on teamwork straight away. And I know we're going to get deeper into that later and maybe a first podcast, but I'm psyched to record with you. So why don't you just start telling the audience a little bit about Latham and Watkins and what you do for your clients?
Sure. So we're a very big law firm, even among big law. We're global, as you said, with 29 offices around the globe, including in every major financial center. We pride ourselves on collaborating across offices and practice groups to advise our clients on their very most complicated and important matters. Personally, I've been practicing, as you said, for almost 30 years, 20 of them as a dedicated capital markets lawyer. I advise on a range of complex equity-linked debt and hybrid securities offerings, as well as general corporate matters. And I do it in good times and bad. So sometimes I'm an IPO lawyer and sometimes I'm a restructuring lawyer. Right now, with our economy on an inflection point, I'm both, which is fun. And then for the past couple of years, I've been proud to serve as a vice chair of our corporate department, which is the largest department in the firm, itself a multi-billion-dollar operation. The department brings together our capital markets, mergers and acquisitions, private equity, real estate, funds formation, and other transactional practices.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the introduction. And I guess that variety of skills and areas to work is key. As you say, that certainly comes back a lot from guests. And before we get into the meat of today's discussion, why don't you just share something unknown or unexpected with our listeners about you?
Yeah, people who know me know I love my job. It's often surprising when I tell people that midway through law school, I really thought I had made a huge mistake in pursuing the law. I had been a philosophy major in undergraduate school and went to law school because it was the default thing for liberal arts smart kids to do, which we'll get to later is not good advice. But after my first year, I was summering. We do summer associate kind of internships at a plaintiff side litigation boutique that focused on asbestos litigation, which at the time was very, big ticket. Plaintiffs lawyers were making a ton of money in that area, and there were a lot of, most corporates were defending it in some way or another. The partners there were very successful, and for a lot of people, it would have been a great start. For me, constitutionally, I just couldn't stand the work. And the American litigation system is a constant compromise of the undeserving getting more than they deserve and the deserving getting less than they deserve. And I just really didn't like it. When you combine that with the grind and minutia of U.S. civil procedure, I just thought, man, I can't spend my life doing this. Luckily for me, my dad gave me the advice to try another area of the law. He was not a lawyer, so kudos to him for knowing that there was more than just lawyers suing each other in the law. And the next year, I worked for an international transactional focused law firm, and the love match was there. And it's been a great career ever since.
So it was good that you stuck at it and found the right area. And obviously that's led to a lot of success.
Exactly.
And I know you mentioned how problem solving and creativity have led to success in your career. So I just wanted to unpack that a little bit, what you could share in that area.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the foundational successes for my career has been that I've tried to never tell clients no when they ask if they can do something. I try to answer with a yes, but. And the but can be crucial, and very often the client doesn't like the but at all. But a good lawyer or any advisor really should try to see problems through the client's perspective first before jamming them into traditional paths, which might ultimately be a no once they understand all the ramifications of what they want to do. But you start off getting on their side and saying yes, but.
I love that take. I talk a lot about reframing the no with the Outram team as well. So that really resonates with me. And again, great advice for advisors, right? To put themselves in the shoes of their clients and the client's perspective. Being an industry leading lawyer, you shared the importance of time management as key to that success. So how do you manage your time effectively, Greg?
So big law lawyers bill their time by tenths of an hour. If I had kept all my timesheets over the years, which I don't, by the way, but if I did, I could tell you what time I took my lunch break in 1998 in theory. So that's one of the big drags of the career. But, being forced to track your time to that level of detail really unlocks a very valuable self-awareness of how you spend your time. And that, I think, has allowed me to develop a pretty well-honed cost-benefit analysis in the sense of, is task X necessary? Is it worth the time investment? Would I be better off doing task Y? So you get really good at that. To give you a concrete example mapped to my personality, I get invited to a lot of industry conferences and other networking events. Conferences in general are fun. Some folks would say that you should go to as many as you can to maximize your networking opportunities. For me, though, that's not really the right answer. I know myself pretty well at this point, and I'm just not a very good schmoozer. I'm in awe of my partners who can go to a cocktail party reception and come away with 3 good leads, but that's just not me. So what is valuable to me at a conference is, one, touching base with a lot of people I already know in one place, outside of the frenzy of a transaction. 2, keeping up on cutting edge ideas. An example of that, I recently attended the annual Goldman Sachs Private Innovative Company Conference. It's an annual event that brings together leaders in the technology space. It delivered both of those things perfectly. Many of the bankers and companies I know and have worked with or want to work with were there. And I heard from a fantastic cast of inspiring speakers from up-and-coming tech companies. I didn't spend a lot of time at the various cocktail mixers, but I did touch base with a number of great people. Thus, that conference was a really good use of my time, even at the cost of billable hours or time with my family. In contrast, last week I went to a cocktail mixer for a legal association. The event was lovely and full of impressive people. I was there primarily in my management role to assess whether Latham should sponsor that association. That was accomplished, and by the way, I think we will sponsor it because I think it would be good for some people. But if it had just been there for myself, it would not have been a good use of my time had my goal been purely to network personally.
Thanks for sharing that. It's really interesting, isn't it? Because the first step you go to when you're trying to drive productivity efficiency is to really look at those hours. And I guess many of us don't do that enough, and that's just become such an ingrained part of what you do. So I can see why that's powerful. And you're right, by the way, that everyone talks about networking on this show. Leaders do it; they know the importance of it, but none of them have quite put it like you about how to really pick that event and pick the ones that are going to add the most value. So I think that's super smart. So thanks for sharing those insights. You shared with me that client relationships have been key to success. You've talked a little bit about how you can connect to build these relationships, but can you share other feedback really on how you've built successful client relationships?
Yeah. So I'll go back to the know yourself comment. Not every client is suited for every lawyer, and I'm sure this is true for investment bankers as well. Some clients want a lawyer who is going to fight for them loudly and aggressively on every point. I'm not that lawyer. I find it to be most effective to try to win points through finding commonalities of interests and try to minimize the points you're actually brawling over. In this regard, I was influenced pretty early on by the book Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and William Ury. I read it in my undergraduate days and reread it every couple of years. I also work in a specialty that features a lot of repeat players, and this is also true for bankers. Burning bridges in one deal may very well hurt my clients in the next, so I'm very cognizant of that. So I guess the point, Peter, is to find clients that match well with your personality. You may be tempted to pursue a client who presents a big opportunity for business, but if it's not a good personality match, I think generally that's going to be self-defeating and no fun. And then once you do find a client you like and who is a good fit, try to foster an authentic relationship. The best way to do that is to look out for them when they are not actively engaged in a matter. If you're engaged in a matter, I think it comes sometimes across as too transactional. So, for example, I might try to share news about a new structure with an investment banking client or share a regulatory update with an in-house general counsel. One particular piece of advice that has really benefited me in my career is to really look out for your contacts in hard times. Even the very smartest people in our business undergo setbacks. A banker may be let go in a riff. A talented founder might fail in their latest startup. Lived through the '08 crisis when Lehman and Bear went under, and had a lot of great contacts at those banks. Latham in general leaned into that and provided free legal advice. We even let the bankers camp out in our conference rooms for a little free real estate while they got resettled. And I can tell you, Peter, people really remember that, helping them when they're in a tough time.
Well, great insight. I love that. Again, I've heard about opportunities within the hard times, but you really humanized it there for me with that example particular. And you're right, isn't it? That's when you can really solidify relationships when the chips are down. So I love that. And we hear a lot about sharing value outside of deal relationships, articles, things like that makes sense. But I love your take on finding the right client that matches your personality. I don't hear much about that from other leaders. So again, it's a really unique perspective. It makes a ton of sense, right? If you're going to create meaningful deals together and long-term relationships. So I love that. I want to talk a little bit about Spotify. I mentioned that in the intro. You were the lead partner on the Spotify listening, and it was a key component of the groundbreaking design. You shared that with me. So what happened and what did you learn from that transaction?
Yeah, so I love to talk about Spotify. I've worked on a lot of innovative transactions in my career. I've been really fortunate in that regard, but Spotify was by far the most marquee. There's never been a deal I worked on that was in the Wall Street Journal more times than that. It was a real watershed moment for me. So one interesting thing, it goes back to networking. I got that opportunity through a beloved former Latham associate who had worked for me for many years and had gone in-house in Spotify. So it starts with a great example of successful networking and the adage that you should always be very nice to everyone along your career from the ground up. When I do talk about Spotify, I do like to start where credit is due. I was the lead lawyer on the Latham team, but the architects of the transaction are really the folks at Spotify. It started with Daniel Ek, who is, of course, the founder of Spotify. He brought the willingness to disrupt and, more importantly, the willingness to invest in the disruption. Many folks I find would love to do something new, but aren't interested in investing the capital, both in terms of money, but probably even more importantly, in terms of time in doing something outside of the mold. Barry McCarthy was the CFO at Spotify at the time. He was a true industry veteran and had seen capital formation from a number of vantage points as a banker, investor, and then from the corporate C-suite. And he was the one who really asked, why does an IPO have to be the only way for a company to go public? And came up with a thesis to essentially split the branding, trading, and listing elements of the IPO away from the capital raising one, enabling arguably a better pricing mechanism for rising listing. And then Horacio was the general counsel, and probably as much as any general counsel I've ever worked with, he really challenged me to say yes, but, and not no.
Tested that theory you mentioned, right?
Yeah. And so for my part, I had the privilege of leading an extremely large and talented team at Latham to deal with what was essentially a single overarching problem, which was how to fit new technology into a set of rules, some of which were literally written in the 1930s, long before any business like Spotify certainly existed. And underneath that very large umbrella lurked hundreds of small issues. That took a ton of brain power and teamwork across Latham's practices. And again, going back to the importance of networking, it drew on help from outside the firm as well. There were lawyers at Mannheimer Swartling, a Swedish law firm called Arendt, which is a Luxembourg law firm. The relevance there is Luxembourg. Spotify is incorporated in Luxembourg. Worked hand in glove with really talented bankers at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, who led the transaction on the banking side, and then worked really closely with colleagues at the New York Stock Exchange and maybe most crucially at the SEC during the 18 months it took to get that deal done. So looking back at that deal, it really crystallized a lot of things I knew already, but had never really fully realized. So it was a real treat.
Congrats on that. As I said, watershed moment, fantastic transaction, and can tell how much effort and creativity and teamwork needed to go into it. So congrats to you and everyone else involved. I want to talk a little bit about deal making. We're there already with this Spotify example, but there's a couple of things I wanted to unpack. First of all was you shared with me that a great lawyer is the grease in a successful transaction. Why is this?
Yeah, so in most transactions, there are three major participants. There's the principals, right? The company's raising the capital or the company's looking to merge. The investment bankers who are acting as the underwriters or advisors on the transaction. And then there's the lawyers. There can be very important additional players, sometimes many, on particular transactions, like outside accounting or tax advisors. The company's auditors are usually in the mix. But the big three are going to be driving most of the deal. And the lawyers are certainly there to make sure things get buttoned up and done properly. That's table stakes. But great lawyers are there to move things along and make sure everything happens smoothly. So we work hand in hand with the bankers to make sure the schedule progresses, to make sure that people responsible for ironing out all the potential bumps along the road are taken care of. Things like regulatory approvals, third-party consents, notices, all that is taken care of. So that's why I use the metaphor that we are the grease in the transaction. We get it done smoothly.
Thanks for sharing that. And I guess it's going to resonate with a lot of our law listeners and the investment banking listeners as well, who obviously go hand in hand and collaborate with you to achieve that. Let's move on a little bit to leadership advice. This is a leadership podcast, and I want to talk a little bit about what it takes to be a top investment banking and corporate finance law leader. As I mentioned, we're breaking ground here with the first law representative on the show. So what advice do you have for the aspiring leaders to make it to the top of the industry?
Yeah, so the first thing I think that's important is to start small and early. Even in your first few years as a lawyer, you'll be given the opportunity to supervise lawyers that are even more junior than you in the first and second years. Start early and then find folks to emulate. So in other words, find senior lawyers whose work styles you like and you like working for. Chances are that makes them good folks to emulate. And it tends to grow from there. A junior partner may supervise a couple very good mid-level associates. And by the time you're at my vintage, you're supervising, or leading a handful of junior partners who are themselves. It's just law. It's the adage is true, is essentially a pyramid. So that's how it works.
Okay, so definitely finding those leaders, emulating, leaning into the opportunities you have earlier in your career and start to do the reps. Yeah, for sure. Yep. And if you had to pick out a few skills that you need to be a great leader, what would you say?
There are many things. Some of them are pretty obvious. The best leaders have to have strong strategic minds. They have to be, flexible in their mindset. I think really good leaders, one of their strengths is realizing when something is not working and when to pivot, particularly at law firms, which are very flat organizational structures. Command and control doesn't work as a leadership tool very well. So you need to be really good at listening to a lot of different viewpoints and building consensus. I think you have to be successful in your own right. Folks will only follow somebody who has demonstrated that they know what a good path to success is. And I think that's true probably at banks as well. And then a really effective leader understands that contribution can come in many different forms and encourages others to use their own talents to bring the most to the institution.
It's a great list. Strong strategic mind, flexible. I like the fact realizing when to pivot. That comes up a lot, and doing the same thing over and over again create problems, as we know. So listening, building consensus, leading by example, we're showing that path to success, as you mentioned, then looking for people to emulate. That's obviously key as well. So I like that. And in terms of you,
if I could just add, Peter.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, going back to the idea of self-awareness, really good law firm leaders also need to understand their own limitations and to surround themselves with folks who compensate for those limitations. I think that's particularly true at law firms where we're perhaps the object lesson in the Peter Principle, given that we're managed by lawyers who have risen up through the firm. So we're inherently, nobody has been trained as a professional manager. I think that's a little different from an investment bank, by the way, where 75% of the cohort has gone to business school or whatever. One of the not so secrets to our success at Latham is the talent of our non-lawyer administration staff. These folks bring skill sets in technology and accounting, people management, and other skill sets that don't come easily to most lawyers. And these contributions really make our leaders look great. So I would emphasize that.
Love that. That makes sense. And again, I guess having people with different strengths around you is obviously going to play a big impact on the overall organization's success. So thanks for sharing that. You talked about learning, emulating. What else has helped you grow and develop into the leader that you are today?
A background in team sports has been surprisingly useful to me. I grew up playing, I guess what you would call football, we'd call it soccer, and basketball. And one of my coaches taught me early on that it's easy to lead a team of superstars, but it's a really talented coach who gets the most out of a team with members of varying strengths and weaknesses. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's stayed with me from both a macro and a micro level to this day. On the micro level, when I'm running a transaction, but it's going to be a tough one and long, complicated, and I think I'll need 2 junior partner lieutenants to properly cover the work. I might look for one who's very strong with management and people skills to be responsible for interacting with the client and ensuring the transaction keeps to schedule. And then I might pick another who not so great at that, but is very strong at technical legal drafting to make sure all the contracts get done at an A+ level. So it's just a micro example of team building that uses folks' strengths and weaknesses to the benefit of the team.
Is it just really knowing every member of the team at that point? And do you have any tactics to really drill in and understand their strengths? Because I'd love to hear that, because a lot of listeners here are parts of teams or putting together teams, and that's not an easy thing to do, to understand the strengths and pick the right people.
It's not. That's a great question. So whenever I work with I often try when I work with a new junior lawyer, I will flat out ask them if they've done anything like what we're about to do. Because at Latham, the variety of transactions we do is we basically do all of them, right? So just because you could be a 3rd or 4th year star associate and not have worked on a transaction like the one I'm about to ask you to work on, that never puts me off if they say no. It just calibrates in my head what level of training I need to go back to. They'll still have the root skills, attention to detail, good drafting skills. I'll know that because that's expected at Latham. But I won't expect them to know the exact jargon of the particular transaction we're working on. So one, just be blunt and ask folks. But it's important if you do that not to be willing for the bad answer, willing to accept the bad answer and teach them through it. And then once you've done that, unfortunately, not everybody will answer that question entirely truthfully. So then you have to actually work with them on the matter and just observe them. Nobody's really going to admit to not being that great of a people person, but it's pretty obvious if you observe folks long enough working with them what their skills, what their strengths are.
Yeah, I love that. It sounds so simple, right? But I'm sure it's not. You got to ask, you got to be direct, you got to understand, read between the lines, observe. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And again, I'm a big believer of playing to the team strengths and individual strengths. So, I love that. And mentorship, has mentorship played a significant role in your career and helped you succeed?
It's a really good question, Peter. Very rare is the person who can see it completely on their own in this business. There's just too much to learn, and so much of it is nuanced or situationally dependent. That kind of stuff is very hard to learn purely from books or even from practice without somebody explaining why you're doing what you're doing, coaching you on how to do it better. So I've been very fortunate to have many mentors over the years, though interesting in my case, never really the formal ones that were periodically assigned with good intentions by the employer. Rather, my mentors have always been folks I sought out organically because I admired some element of their practice or style. I would approach them and ask to be put on their next deal. And if that deal worked out, it often led to more deals, sometimes many more deals. And I always found most senior folks are very open to this sort of informal mentorship. I think a lot of folks in our industry, both legal and banking, stay with it because of the opportunity to work with young people. It's one of the real fun parts of the profession.
Love that. I couldn't agree more that kind of the organic way of building mentors is key. And you're right. A lot of the leaders I speak to are so open to being mentors. It's just a case of having that conversation. So love
Yeah.
that.
And then I'd also add it's very important to distinguish between mentors and sponsors. You need both to succeed at big law or in banking. Sponsors, to differentiate from mentors, are folks who have cachet within the organization to lend their political capital to your own advancement. And not every sponsor is a mentor, and not every mentor is a sponsor, and they don't really need to be. You get different things from each. I would say that the sponsor relationship is more transactional. The best way to secure a sponsor, frankly, is to become so valuable to them that you're indispensable. That sounds a little mercenary, but it's really not meant to be. It's just an example of institutional awareness that's necessary for success. I've seen a lot of talented lawyers frustrated in their ambitions because, ironically, they work for too many partners, such that not any one or two is willing to really be a sponsor. Or on the flip side, folks who only worked for one or two, who then don't have enough juice to push the person forward. So it's just something to be aware of
Yeah,
as you navigate a complex institution.
great feedback, and I'm sure the listeners will take that on board. And I can understand the difference between that. I guess the sponsorships are relating much more on performance and the harder results, as you say, and a different relationship. And what do you see as the biggest opportunities for leaders in the industry today?
There's some big ones in big law in particular. First, in big law, I think we're going to continue to see a division between the haves and have not firms. That's actually similar to what we're seeing in culture in general. But every recession we go through seems to hurt the weaker firms while benefiting the stronger ones. I think that's because in difficult times, it's easier for the stronger firms to hire away top talent. And then when the market returns, which it often does tentatively, we're seeing that now, clients naturally turn to industry leaders to de-risk. That's a cycle. I've seen it. This is my third market correction I've been through in my career, and that's happened every time. When I came out of law school, there were probably 50 firms I would have considered peers to Latham. Today, there's just a fraction of that, and I think that flywheel is going to continue. Second, I mentioned, and it's a little faddish to mention it, but I think AI will absolutely change the profession. Ultimately, I think it'll force a rethinking of the leverage model and the billable hour, and the firms that transition that effectively will unlock enormous value, but it's probably a smaller profession at the end of it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges that you see for leaders today?
I would say each of those opportunities I just mentioned is also a challenge. Competition for talent right now is fierce. We're very proud at Latham that we remain a top destination for the very best talent at all levels, but we really can't be complacent. And in particular, we can't sacrifice the culture we've been careful to cultivate over the years. Once that goes, it's hard to get back. AI can be, I think, viewed as an umbrella, under the umbrella of the challenge of technology evolving at a rapid pace. Here, I think a smart law firm leader invests in, as I said earlier, very heavily in non-lawyer talent, since very few lawyers would make good software engineers.
That makes sense. And I guess there's so much to unpack from AI still, and it makes sense. And I hear a lot about competition for talent. We spent a lot of time looking back throughout this interview, and I want to start looking forward a little bit. Are a leading expert in the capital markets. So what do you see as the emerging trends in the capital markets area?
The first one, I think, is companies are staying private longer in order to avoid regulation and the attendant hassle of things like public reporting of financials. As a result, some private companies have achieved truly amazing size. You hear this phrase sometimes, is private is the new public. These companies still need to finance, though, and so we've seen a huge rise in all sorts of private options to the public markets, from new ways of doing private secondary transactions, including trading platforms, to really vast pools of private capital. I think, like many things, this is probably more accurately part of a cycle, and eventually things will swing the other way. But until it does, this trend is creating a lot of opportunity for creative lawyers and bankers.
Creativity keeps coming back as markets continue to evolve and change, and innovation comes up a lot in how you think and how you approach deals. So it's good to see that's your mindset as well. And it's interesting your take on the private options coming to the public market too. So thanks for sharing. And just generally for 2025, we're recording this in February, be going out in March. But what's your outlook for this year?
I'm optimistic. This is the third market correction I've lived through, and every time we come out of one, the length of time it takes is somewhat proportionate to how high the peak was. And 2021 was an enormous peak. So I think the fact that it's taking a little longer for things to go back to steady state makes a ton of sense. But we're starting to see signs that it is, in terms of the number and types of transactions that we're seeing in the market. Advantage of being a manager is I get very frequent reports on how busy our lawyers are, and we're getting busy. So if you view a global transactional law firm as a good barometer of how the economy is going, it's going in the right way.
That's great to hear. I love the optimism, and I think after last year, it can only start to get better again. And we've certainly seen that on our end in terms of deal celebration. So it's great to hear that from you too. A couple of questions, and we're back at looking back again now. I love asking this question to my guests, and it's, if you went back and talked to yourself in your early part of your career, knowing what you know now, what piece of advice would you give yourself?
I'm pretty fortunate. There's very little I would change. The main thing I would do is crystallize all the things we've been talking about and give it to my younger self earlier. So, I wish, if I had a time machine, I would have networked earlier. I would have been more generous with favors earlier. I would have looked for mentorship earlier. These are all the things I learned along the way, but it would have been nice if somebody had just told them to me up front.
There you go. At least this episode, it will be served to the law community, and those listening can take hold of that and use it to help them improve their career quicker. So again, thanks for sharing. Believe it or not, we're moving towards the end of the episode. So a few questions before we wrap. First of all, any books, podcasts, materials that you recommend to our listeners that have had an impact on you?
Yeah, so a recent one, I now know he can be a bit polarizing, but I've become a big fan of Scott Galloway. I picked up his book, The Algebra of Happiness, and it really, to the theme of crystallizing, it crystallized some things that I've always suspected to be true, but couldn't really articulate for myself. For example, I firmly agree with him that the common advice to follow your passion is well-meaning but fundamentally flawed. Unless you come from money, I think better advice to a young person is to tell them to find a job they like well enough, but that they're good at and commands a good income. And my own career has really been an object lesson in the benefits of an early sacrifice of hours to the benefit of your older self. So that book really resonated with me. I've since followed him on his podcast, Pivot, and he has his own as well. And he's just a really interesting guy, a real sharp thinker.
Perfect. That's great. I've not heard of Algebra of Happiness, but we'll pop that in the show notes for those who want to pick it up. And the work hard early in your career, set yourself up for success. I really believe in that model too. So again, thanks for sharing. So you've got a few thousand listeners here. Anything I haven't asked you that you feel the audience should know?
So I guess, Peter, I'd love to leave the audience with the idea that both lawyers and investment bankers they're both professions that get an unfairly bad rap. I think that's unfair. The rule of law and the U.S. engine of capital formation both play fundamental parts in the American success story. So I'd leave the reader with the idea that participation in our industry can yield a meaningful life if done with integrity, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Wow, what a powerful way to end. So thanks so much for that, Greg. Really appreciate it. And thanks for sparing your time. I know how busy you are across the corporate department and everything else that you have on your plate. So thanks for taking the time out to spend it with us and the listeners. Really appreciate that.
It has been my pleasure.
Thanks, Greg. Take care. This episode of the podcast was brought to you by the Investment Banking Leaders Club. And to keep leveling up your career, join the club at ibleadersclub.com for exclusive insights, leadership strategies, and career growth resources straight from the industry's top professionals. I want to say thanks to our key partner, Outram, the global leader in financial deal gifts, awards, and recognition, for their ongoing support of our mission to empower both aspiring and senior investment banking leaders. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, best of luck on your growth journey.